Here's Holden. I've got Holden queued up, but what I'm going to show you is, Barry's been talking. Barry Pollock has been giving all of these specifics about the case, and he digs into the things that you've heard about the password cracking conspiracy that aren't true. You've heard that WikiLeaks dumped files on the internet, and he describes and really very meticulously outlines why that isn't true. And he's picking apart the US government's own case based upon how it has been brought against his client, Julian Assange. And then
And so what the government has...
I'm sorry, I'm just going to leave it there because I want to turn to somebody else at this point.
Absolutely.
Holden Triplett, you heard this specific description of the course of events. I want to get your take.
Sure, thanks very much. Let me just start off by saying I am not with the government, nor do my views are my own at this point. I'm not representing the views of the US government or the FBI specifically. So I think maybe we can just take a step back, because I'm not sure if what we want to do up here is sort of completely litigate the specifics of the case. And just think about what we're actually dealing with here. And I think it's important to think of the entire narrative and the arc of the organization. And that helps inform why the government is so concerned about this. And what we have essentially is an organization that has called itself essentially an intelligence agency that is trying to inform the people of the world, and has said that they want to hack to bring that information out and to publish it. Now, again, this is an organization that has generally been used against a number of different governments within the world, but has worked specifically very hard against the US government. It is not a US entity. Assange is not a US citizen. So again, injecting themselves in our conversation here, in our dynamic of figuring out what is the balance between security and privacy in this sense. And so I think it's important to think about who is the actor that we're talking about here before we start to get into the specifics about what might be misconceptions that are out there. So there's two basic charges within the superseding well, there's 18 charges, but two basic ones, which essentially is there's a computer hacking charge, and then there's the charges under the Espionage Act. And so as Barry laid out, there is at least a narrative that's out there about whether or not the hacking, how big of a part that played in the overall exploitation of receiving information, or whether it was a part of it that was necessary in order to get the information out. But I'm not sure that actually matters for whether or not the case, if someone actually has broken the law in order they're making an attempt to actually extract additional information. So while it may or may not be, and again, I think we should stay kind of a little bit on the wave tops here on the specifics of this, may or may not be actually impactful on the information that's coming out, if Assange took these actions, essentially was encouraging someone and actually trying to help them to hack into a US government system, that is a violation of US law. And that is not someone who is protected in terms of publishing that information. Generally, that is not something the Supreme Court has decided to protect in those types of actions.
Okay, I'm going to pause there.
Okay. The best part's still coming. I just want the viewers to
know the best part is coming, but there is one little bit of setup I want to do. But go ahead. You want to say anything about what Holden just said there?
I mean, what is there to say to this? I mean, Barry has pretty thoroughly debunked the misconceptions about Julian Assange. Holden Triplett's idea that before we can discuss misconceptions, let's discuss who WikiLeaks is, and then gives this propagandist depiction of them is, I mean, Triplett knows what he's doing here, and I don't want to litigate the case. I mean, I wonder why, right? I mean,
yeah,
he doesn't ever actually engage with what WikiLeaks revealed. He doesn't ever actually engage with the case against Julian Assange. He discussed his questions with the moderator beforehand. He tips that off later in the panel, which I don't know if everyone got that or just him. I mean, I've definitely done panels where I've let everyone know what I'm going to ask, right? Because they're not like hostile panels. So, but he comments on one of the questions later on that this isn't one of the ones we discussed. And like he just is giving this extraordinarily propagandistic view of WikiLeaks. They claim they're an intelligence agency. I mean, go back and look at all of the publications in the 70s and 80s that are reporting on the CIA and the FBI, you know, who watches the, or not, no one say who watches the watch, but like, you know, like, like the government's spying on you, so we're reporting on the government. I mean, Defending Rights to Dissent has repeatedly said the FBI investigates dissent, so we're going to investigate the FBI. We're not an intelligence agency, right? That is a common bit of rhetorical move that people who report on critical information about the intelligence state, about domestic security uses. So that's already, and then it gets to this point where he's not American and he's asserting himself in our debate about the lines between privacy or secrecy and public disclosure. And the only reason Julian Assange is part of the US debate about secrecy versus public disclosure is because the United States government is prosecuting him and his sources for disclosing public information, right? He didn't say, I'm going to start a debate about the First Amendment in the US. He said, I have newsworthy information about war crimes, about abuses of power, and I'm going to work with the New York Times, The Guardian, El País, Le Monde, and other papers to publish them. And then the US government decided, let's have a debate about, secrecy versus transparency. So it's just incredibly propagandistic framing. It's subtle at parts, it's not subtle at other parts, and it just, I mean, it's indicative of his worldview, but as I'll explain later, I got an even scarier insight into his worldview, and by comparison, his comments are quite restrained compared to what he said to me after the panel, which was the most disturbing conversation I've ever had in Washington, D.C.
So we'll keep people in suspense and save that for the end here as we're winding down our broadcast. But I just hear multiple times say that he wants to stay up on the wave tops and he's not going to get into the weeds or talk about the specifics. And I have to ask myself, does he even really know what he's talking about? Is he qualified to talk about this case? Because there's nothing in this panel that gives me a sense that he knows about the chain of events that unfolded in 2010 and 2011. And as you're going to see here, I think that's borne out by the fact that Barry Pollock, before this, describes what happened with David Lee of The Guardian, who was an editor, a lead editor at The Guardian, who Julian Assange wrote down on a piece of paper a password and gave it to him so that he could open an encrypted file. And that encrypted file would give them access to U.S. State Embassy cables, the U.S. State Department cables, these cables that were over 250,000 files that Chelsea Manning provided to WikiLeaks. And he publishes the password in his book, which he co-authors with Luke Harding. And this tell-all book about working with WikiLeaks that contains a lot of attacks that are borderline slander against Assange and WikiLeaks that feed into these narratives that the Pentagon and other U.S. government agencies are pushing in 2011 and beyond. It eventually, there are individuals out there, as people may know, that figure out that they have found the file and, let's try this password that was put in the book by David Lee and see if it might open this encrypted file. And then it does. And then there's a lot of danger because all of the files in the cache of documents, not just the ones that have been published, but the ones that have not been published yet, including ones that have not been curated and gone over so that sources could be protected, those are now going to be available for everyone to read, no matter what, whether WikiLeaks puts them on their website or not. So anyways, that's my rundown for people so you understand what this next part is. And so let's hear Holden tell everyone what he thinks about this. These are facts, by the way. This isn't some theory. Barry Pollock lays out the facts of what happened with The Guardian, David Lee, and these cables becoming publicly available to everyone on the internet. And then how WikiLeaks called the State Department and they were like, you should do something. People are going to be in trouble. And then to that, this is how a former FBI agent on the panel responds.
The second was a very nuanced and complicated piece of it. I don't know the specifics of this, but I can tell you what it smells like. it smells like an intelligence operation to me. This is a very typical sort of tactic of how Russian intelligence works. They use individuals and they use people as proxies, and many times they may be unwitting in which ways they would do that. Sometimes they may be witting in order to leak this type of information. So creating a situation where there was it was told it was a temporary password to some person so that they could push this information out, versus saying that it was a permanent password that could be unchanged. This is the type of information that a Russian intelligence service, this is how they would operate in order to push that information out.
This is completely bonkers, right? This is unhinged. I mean, you could, if you want to make the case that WikiLeaks is a Russian intelligence agency, which I think is a bullshit case, like even conceding you could do a less unhinged job than this. I mean, the idea that, I don't even know where you start with. I mean, I, like you, I've written about the series of events by which the State Department cables, unredacted, became available. They're an extremely convoluted set of facts, right? The idea that WikiLeaks purposefully told David Lee it was a temporary password, knowing that he would then make it the chapter title in his book 3 months later, and then 7 months later, a German website would figure this out.
Man,
right?
He had some elite KGB training. If that's
and also that's a typical Russian tactic. I mean, WikiLeaks could have just published all the information on the website. The Russians could have made like a cutout organization and done this. I mean, if this is a typical Russian espionage tactic, then what this tells me is that GRU is extraordinarily convoluted and not very, very smart, and that they're very lucky that this harebrained scheme of telling someone something is a temporary password, hoping they then publish it as a chapter in their book, and then 7 months later, German newspaper figures it out. I mean, it confounds any basic sense of reason. And this is what this guy does. He just keeps saying, this is typical Russian this is typical Russian that. You don't know this, but right now you're engaging in typical Russian disinformation. And it's just like, I don't know.
Yeah. So what we know is that David Lee was technologically illiterate and a nimwit. And
I'm technologically illiterate and a nimwit as well, so I sympathize somewhat here.
But we also know that he was a nimwit to a fault, because people like Italian journalist Stefania Marizzi, who can tell you stories about working and collaborating with WikiLeaks, and she does so in great detail in her English. You should pick up the English translation of her book, Secret Power: WikiLeaks and Its Enemies, about what it was like to collaborate and work with WikiLeaks, the reality of working with WikiLeaks, not the espionage fantasy that is being spun by Holden Triplett and other FBI agents out there who get paid to speak about this when they have no idea about anything in this case. The reality is that there were really strict security procedures that had to be followed when people were using these documents, when they were opening these files. Access could be gone in like an hour or two, depending on what files were sent. Putting the encrypted file out on the internet was a standard thing to do, but you would download it and you wouldn't ever tell anybody what you used to open that encrypted file, because that would be how that file could be out there available for those people around the world to access it and open those files and do work globally. This is what enabled media partners to do the work that was necessary for their newspapers in order to talk about what these cables showed about these specific countries. And meanwhile, you had people like David Lee, who I understand were getting impatient with WikiLeaks because they had all these strict security protocols and they thought this was slowing everything down. And we want to publish their stories. We want to get our headlines and everything out there and tell people about this. Why do we have to wait, Julian Assange? Stop telling us we have to wait, Julian Assange. We're ready to go.